Hello, this is Dr. Odom. Today is March 21st. It's about 5:30, and I'm redoing two videos that were for week 10. The comments that I'd made about the readings and the bibliographic essay last year were relevant, but at least one person said that they couldn't get the videos to play because they're not YouTube videos, so these will be, and everyone should be able to access them. I'm going to break my comments up into two videos. One will be just about the readings, and one will be about the bibliographic essay in case you need to go back to one topic or another. So I'll start out by talking about the readings in this video. I wanted to make it clear, reiterating what I've said in announcements, that I've changed the schedule according to y'all's feedback. And for this week, this is week 9 that we're in right now, the 21st through the 25th, your deadline for your projects was today, annotated bibliography and discussion board posts. And response. No reading quiz. But I'm shifting so that next week, week 10, the content is mostly posted. There is a reading quiz. You have a discussion board post and response, but everything will be due at the end of the week on midnight of April 3rd. So you get kind of a 2-week break. This is kind of building a spring break gap into your schedule. So let me know how that goes. Some of the due dates shifted a little bit for your bibliographic essay. I'll get to that in a second. So what you need to do in response to these readings will be due on April 3rd. So you should have plenty of time to let this framing sink in and read, and then do your quiz and your discussion board posts. So this week the theme is political and critical pedagogy. Those terms go hand in hand, and they are descended from, at least in big part, Paulo Frere's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We read a lot about this already in the Berlin book, and so we're continuing in that thread from Freire through Berlin, and lots of other thinkers in composition have picked up this topic and this stance as well. A foundational idea in critical pedagogy, that's usually what it's called, is that ideology is always complicit in the classroom. You can't be outside of ideology, so you will be taking political stances on subjects related to your discipline. You may not intend them to be, you may not see them that way, but critical theorists say that you are on a very, very basic level taking either a conservative or progressive stance about something. And that would be about writing and about language in our case. I may be sending some of y'all some chapters from this lovely book, A Guide to Composition Pedagogies, 2nd edition, because they have great overviews and reading lists about different approaches to composition. There's a chapter about critical pedagogy, and I think it's by Anne George. It provides a couple of really succinct descriptions of what is meant by critical pedagogy, and it goes by some other names too. So she says on page 77, traditionally critical pedagogies, aka liberatory pedagogy, empowering pedagogy, radical pedagogy, progressive pedagogy, or pedagogy of possibility or hope or love, envision a society not simply pledged to, but successfully enacting the principles of freedom and social justice. And she quotes another scholar called McLaren here, quote, dedicated to the emancipatory imperatives of self-empowerment and social transformation, end quote. Traditional critical pedagogies engage students in analyses of the unequal power relations that produce and are produced by cultural practices and institutions, including schools, and they hope to enable students to challenge this inequality. So you can see how this is a very political and progressive political project, which you've seen in Berlin, and you probably already have some kind of opinion about just based on that reading. So that's why one of the readings for this week is to just scan over the table of contents of the Norton Book of Composition Studies, and especially toward the end of the table of contents in the book, you can identify groups that have traditionally lacked privilege, who lack status. So I'd just like you to scan through and see what those groups are. And the two major readings are about a feminist approach to teaching composition, and then an approach to teaching language use or literacy to specifically African American students, but also poor students. What else did I need to say? Okay, so because the roots of critical pedagogy were from Ferreira, he was in Brazil. His book is called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. How does that translate to an American context? It's a question that was brought to my attention when I was at UT Austin and I took a literature pedagogy class from one of my favorite professors, Brian Bremen. And we read Pedagogy of the Oppressed in his class, but he pointed out that especially because UT Austin is a flagship university, top students from Texas and across the country go there. Why are we talking about pedagogy of the oppressed? Maybe we should be talking about pedagogy of the oppressors, which is a good question to ask yourself when reading these texts and when thinking about your own teaching, whether you do that now or you're thinking about it. But of course, we have very diverse populations in the US, so that may apply to some, but not other groups. Critical pedagogy, or political in the sense of identity politics, and you'll recognize lots of different mentions of identity. I think it's really been influential in the field of composition studies since the 90s. Before then, but it's really been an important wave since the 90s. And if you check out any sort of recent, in the last 20 years or so, NCTE journals like College English or College Composition and Communication, 3Cs, you can see this just from their table of contents too, that a lot of the articles focus on different communities, and especially ones who lack privilege, and how to teach them, or about their writing, things like that. And you see that too in the Norton Book of Composition Studies. Okay, so I'll get into specifically the two readings from the Norton Book of Composition Studies that I assigned to you. The Delpit article is pretty easy to read. It's easy to get through. It won't take you very long, probably. It's very important, and I think a lot of you will find it very thought-provoking. Delpit is Linda is an education scholar from Harvard, and this is part of her book. So her field is really education, but it's about language and teaching reading and writing. So that's why it's in our book. Just notice how many times she uses words that go along with critical pedagogy, such as the disenfranchised, dominant, resistant, identity, empower, access, oppression, or liberation, or liberatory, different versions of those types of words. So I think it's easy to see how this fits in the critical pedagogy trajectory. The other article is not so easy to read, and I want to give you a framework to help you understand some of the more difficult concepts and some of the theoretical background that you might not have yet, and that's fine. So you'll be introduced, if you haven't been already, to a little bit of Foucault and his idea, especially about history versus genealogy. He's one of the deconstructionists and postmodern theorists. He's French, so she refers to French theory that rejects what they call meta-narratives and narratives of progress. These are very traditional and typical stories we tell ourselves about the march of progress, and this story that summarizes the history of people or institutions or a culture or whatever in terms of cause and effect, like something that happened first influenced something else to happen, and it's this kind of semi-neat narrative that deconstructionists say it's kind of a fiction. They say basically that reality is more complicated than that narrative, and history is flawed because of this. So you'll recognize Foucault's influence on Rhodes project of recovering what radical feminism has meant to the theories of feminism in composition. So she in some ways agrees with Foucault's theorization of history, or historiography, which is how history is written. So she agrees with it partially, she disagrees with it. She also critiques who she calls cultural feminists. Particularly, she critiques their idea of essentialism, that there is something in the essence of women that makes us all the same, that we all share certain characteristics or experiences, and that to kind of make these universal statements or essentializing statements about women and how women write, or how women teach or should teach, how women work in the academy, she resists that idea pretty strongly. And you can see different ways that she does that throughout her article. Excuse me, it's not an article, it's the introductory chapter to a book, and that's why it feels different than an article. It takes a while to get going. And I do want to point out also about the structure of that chapter in your book. She's doing the kind of lit review that I don't want you to do, really, because she's taking certain key texts that she will be arguing against, in part, and she's summarizing and analyzing those and telling you what part they'll play in her book, her critique of those, etc. So she kind of divides it up into texts. And I don't want you to do that in your bibliographic essay, but I'll talk about that in the next video. Okay, so going back to feminists in composition and especially essentializing, she shows you or describes these books that will sort of equate expressivism and process pedagogy and collaborative pedagogy as things that are, or approaches that are essentially feminine or feminist. So that's a major idea that she's pushing back against, and will push her back against in her book. So those are some basic ideas that you should pick up on in the chapter. And for both of these texts in the Norton book, there is a reading quiz over them, and you can open it up and like get the terms that I would like to highlight in those chapters and match them up the best you can, but you can basically use the quiz itself to guide your reading, and I would recommend doing that. And then you can take the quiz by April 3rd. Okay, I think that is all I wanted to say about the readings for week 10. I'll just start a video right after this about the bibliographic essay, so you can go back to that one if you need to watch it later, however you want to do it. Okay, so that's it for now.